Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to part 2 of Epic History TV's The History of Russia with yours truly. Thank you all very much for answering the questions that I had in the comments on the last video. Thank you for telling me who the Tectonic Knights were. I should have known that from playing Assassin's Creed back in 2007. Why Russia invaded all of Siberia. I will check out the Great Northern War video from Epic History TV as well. How Peter the Great is seen modernly. Thank you for the few Russians that chimed in and sort of what you guys learned in school and everything, as well as what Christianity and its role during this point in time. So if you have no idea what I'm talking about, go check out part 1, read the comments there. They were really, really well thought out. Thank you all to everyone. There was a big list, so hey, let's go through there. Where we left off is that Catherine the Great has usurped, in a way, Peter III, who died under mysterious circumstances. I guess this is a long-running theme. And now it is her time, right? Catherine the Great is also considered great, just as Peter. And let's see what she does. Thank you all very much if you've liked and comment subscribed already. If you have not, please do so. All helps the channel. Trying to hit 1K subscribers. Let's get into it. Oh, that was very anticlimactic, wasn't it?
Catherine was a student and admirer of the French Enlightenment, and even corresponded with the French philosopher Voltaire. She reigned as an enlightened autocrat. Her power was unchecked, but she pursued ideals of reason, tolerance, and progress. Catherine became a great patron of the arts and learning. Schools and colleges were built. The Bolshoi Theatre was founded, as well as the Imperial Academy of Fine Arts, while her own magnificent collection of artwork now forms the basis of the world-famous Hermitage Museum.
Fascinating.
Catherine encouraged...
So that's one interesting thing about royals at the time too, is that they really had a lot of power to push the arts and the sciences and education, right? One thing I think of is that Prussia and its education system, which is still something that has influence in the modern education system to this day. And it's just really fascinating that just one individual person that goes, well, I'm interested in arts, I'm interested in science, I'm interested in this, and can just push a country towards that single direction, which is something that we don't really have as much in today's sense. I am not advocating for going back to an authoritarian monarchy, but it's just kind of interesting that that one person has all that power to really push a whole country in one way.
Europeans to move to Russia to share their expertise, and helped German migrants to settle in the Volga region, where they became known as Volga Germans. Their communities survived nearly 200 years, until on Stalin's orders, they were deported east at the start of World War II.
I was just going to say that.
Catherine's reign also saw enormous territorial expansion. In the south, Russia defeated the Ottoman Empire, winning new lands and the fortresses of Azov and Kerch. But then Catherine faced a major peasant revolt, led by the renegade Cossack Yemelyan Pugachev. The rebels took many fortresses and towns and stormed the city of Kazan before they were finally defeated by the Russian army.
Okay, wait, I got another question for you guys. So a Cossack, I thought a Cossack referred to as like a member of cavalry, because there's oh no, that's Polish Hussars. What are Cossacks? If you guys wouldn't mind letting me know down below, I'm curious.
Catherine then forcibly incorporated the Zaporozhian Cossacks into the Russian Empire.
So is it an ethnicity?
The Crimean Khanate, a thorn in Russia's side for 300 years. Russia's new lands in the south were named Novorussia, New Russia. Sparsely populated, they were settled by Russian colonists under the supervision of Prince Potemkin, Catherine's advisor and lover. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, exhausted by war and at the mercy of its neighbors, was carved up in a series of partitions, with Russia taking the lion's share. Poland did not re-emerge as an independent nation until 1918.
I was just going to say that. Thank you for beating me to it. And so the story of the Poles is really one of really being divided by its neighbors. And this goes throughout all of history. Maybe I'll do a video series on Poland. I'm liking doing these video series on specific countries. Right now I'm on Russia. I don't know, maybe I'll pick Poland or something next, or maybe Austria. But yeah, a story of being divided by its neighbors, unfortunately. But I'll save that one for another video.
Large Jewish population from Poland, who Catherine decreed could live only in the so-called Pale of Settlement, and were excluded from most cities.
Sad, considering I'm wearing
France, the French Revolution led to the execution of King Louis XVI. Catherine was horrified, and in the last years of her reign, completely turned her back on the liberal idealism of her youth.
Interesting.
3 years later, Catherine died, ending one of the most glorious reigns in Russian history. She was succeeded by her son, Paul, a man obsessed by military discipline and detail, and opposed to all his mother's works.
And a very large forehead, apparently.
Russia joined the coalition of European powers, fighting revolutionary France. Marshal Suvorov, one of Russia's greatest military commanders, won a series of victories against the French in northern Italy. But the wider war was a failure. Meanwhile, Paul's reforms had alienated Russia's army and nobility, and he was murdered in a palace coup.
Another one.
He was succeeded by his 23-year-old son Alexander, who shared his grandmother Catherine's vision for a more modern Russian state. His advisor, the brilliant Count Mikhail Speransky, reformed administration and finance. Yet the emperor refused to back his plans for a liberal constitution. Ultimately, it was war with France that would dominate Alexander's reign.
Yep, and would dominate Europe for the next few decades, right? It's just the war, the Napoleonic Wars and everything. One topic that I have not yet touched on is the Napoleonic Wars. Obviously, some of the most important wars in European history. But again, it's not a topic that I know really a ton about. I know a bit, but it's not as much my forte, but it is something that I want to look up on. As I said, I have seen the 3.5-hour video from Epic History TV on Napoleon. Brilliant series. But I'll probably start with maybe Oversimplified first or something like that. And then maybe we'll do a video series on France. Let me know what you guys think in the comment. What country, in the comment section below, what country should I cover next? Maybe Poland, France? I don't know. Let me know what you think. There you go. Beat me to it.
France had a new emperor, Napoleon Bonaparte,
yes,
who inflicted a series of defeats on Russia and her allies at Austerlitz, Eylau,
yep,
and Friedland. But at Tilsit in 1807, the two young emperors met and made an alliance.
They were friends for a bit too.
Russia attacked Sweden, annexing Finland, which became an autonomous Grand Duchy within the Russian Empire. But then, in 1812, Napoleon invaded Russia.
Yep. And Finland would not get its independence until after the Russian Revolution, where it was guaranteed by Lenin that the Finns would be free. However, they would eventually go on to fight the Winter War, which, yeah, will be covered here. But yes, Finland, another country. So many countries that I want to do video series on.
At Borodino, French and Russian armies clashed in a gigantic battle, one of the bloodiest of the age. Napoleon emerged victorious, but the Russian army escaped intact. Napoleon occupied Moscow, which was destroyed by fire.
So that's
and
the fourth time, I think?
Refused to negotiate, the French army was forced to make a long retreat through the Russian winter,
yep,
and was annihilated. Napoleon had been dealt a mortal blow.
So it was something like, I think it was something like he marched in with roughly 1 million men, and I think around 800,000 of them died. Now, I'm not exactly sure on those figures, of course, but the overwhelming majority of those that marched into Russia never got a chance to march out of Russia. And this was at a different time when supply lines were not like modern supply lines where you have, obviously you have cavalry at the time, but You don't have the same level of technology that obviously even something like the First World War or the Second World War brought. And so there was a lot of soldiers that were forced to really live off the land, which is difficult enough to do in Russia anyways, let alone when you're an invading force in the hundreds of thousands, up to 1 million men or more.
And Russia, alongside Prussia, Austria and Britain, then led the fight back, which ended in the capture of Paris and Napoleon's abdication.
And notice War of the Sixth Coalition. Again, we'll get into this with the Napoleon videos, but Sixth Coalition until he was defeated, and then ultimately with the Seventh until he was really defeated.
At the Congress of Vienna, as part of the spoils of war, Alexander became King of Poland.
And again, also something, the Congress of Vienna, one of the most important congresses, moments in European history, completely redivided the map. And yeah, again, this is going to be another video I get into. Lots of videos coming out here in the late 18th and early 19th century.
Then, with Austria and Prussia, he formed the Holy Alliance, with the aim of preventing further revolutions in Europe.
Kind of worked.
Meanwhile, in the Balkans and Caucasus, Russia had been waging intermittent wars against the Ottoman Empire, Persia, and local tribes. The frontier had been pushed south to incorporate Bessarabia, Circassia, Chechnya, and much of modern Georgia, Dagestan, Azerbaijan, and Armenia.
Fascinating.
But the peoples of the Caucasus bitterly resisted Russian rule. Russia's attempt to impose its authority on the region led to the Caucasian War, a brutal conflict fought amongst the mountains and forests that would drag on for nearly 50 years.
50 years?
Alexander was
I've never heard of this
by
before.
his brother Nicholas, a conservative and reactionary. But parts of Russian society had now developed an appetite for European-style liberalism, including certain army officers who'd seen other ways of doing things during the Napoleonic Wars.
Sorry, can we just say that was a war that lasted 50 years, the Caucasian Wars? All right, let me know. Tell me some interesting facts about that one in the comment section, because, wow, 50 years. Okay, I've never even heard of that war in my life. Fascinating.
They saw Nicholas as an obstacle, and the new emperor's first challenge would be military revolt.
Okay. All right, how'd he handle that one?
1825. Victory over Napoleon had confirmed Russia's status as a world power. But there was discontent within Russia amongst intellectuals and army officers, some of whom had formed secret societies to plot the overthrow of Russia's autocratic system.
Beautiful.
When Emperor Alexander was succeeded, not as expected by his brother Constantine, but by a younger brother Nicholas, one of these secret societies used the confusion to launch a military coup. But the Decembrist revolt, as it became known, was defeated by loyalist troops, and the ringleaders were hanged. Others were sent into internal exile in Siberia. This was to become a common sentence for criminals and political prisoners in Tsarist Russia.
To the gulags.
Nicholas went on to adopt an official doctrine of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. The state was to rest on the pillars of church, Tsar, and the Russian national spirit, a clear rejection of the values of European liberalism.
So, with Kraut's video on the origins of authoritarianism in Russia, I don't remember if he accounted for this period as well, though. So, if, as it said, all the power sort of really goes to the top and the inequalities are very large, and with the peasants having to, etc., going into that video, was during sort of Catherine's and Paul's and the other further emperors up until Nicholas here, was that sort of not as much the case? Was this system of autocracy still being exercised, but I'm curious though, like there's just sort of some gaps here that I can't exactly fill in. Guys, let me know in the comment section below. Really, I'm very interested. Maybe I'll actually go back and rewatch the autocracy
clashes with Persia led to a war which ended in complete Russian victory. The Treaty of Turkmenchai forced Persia to cede all its territories in the region to Russia and pay a large indemnity.
So this is while the Caucasus Wars are still going on,
Russian
no?
support for Greece in its war of independence against the Ottomans led to war between Russia and the Ottoman Empire. Russian victory brought further gains in the Black Sea region.
Interesting.
A Polish revolt, led by young army officers, was crushed by Russian troops. Alexander Pushkin, Russia's greatest poet, was shot in a duel, and 2 days later died from his wounds.
That reminds me of Alexander Hamilton, one of the founding fathers who was killed in just the stupidest way possible in a duel. You got to think of how much intellectual, what would you say, intellectual weight, capacity, progress was lost through stupid things like dueling for honor. Ugh. Anyways.
Nicholas sent troops to help put down a Hungarian revolt against Austrian rule. The emperor's willingness to help suppress liberal revolts won him the nickname the Gendarme, or policeman of Europe. Russia's first major railway was opened, connecting St. Petersburg and Moscow.
Right, so here's the serfs, right? So how was this sort of the beginnings of that autocracy, you know what I mean?
Alexander Herzen, a leading intellectual critic of Russia's autocracy,
the ramping up of this autocracy.
Emigrated to London, where he continued to call for reform in his homeland. He'd later be described as the father of Russian socialism. The Ottoman Empire, now known as the sick man of Europe, reacted to further Russian provocations by declaring war. The Russian Black Sea Fleet inflicted a crushing defeat on the Turks at the Battle of Sinope. But Britain and France, alarmed at Russia's southern expansion and potential control of Constantinople, declared war on Russia. The Allies landed troops in Crimea and besieged the naval base of Sevastopol, which fell after a grueling year-long siege. In the Baltic, British and French warships blockaded the Russian capital, St. Petersburg.
Fascinating. I didn't even know about this.
Russia was forced to sign a humiliating peace, withdraw its forces from the Black Sea, and put on hold plans for further southern expansion.
I didn't even know about that war. Wow.
Nicholas I was succeeded by his son, Alexander II. The Crimean War had exposed Russia's weakness. The country
obviously
lagged far behind its European rivals in industry, infrastructure, and military power. So Alexander, unlike his father, decided to embrace reform. The most obvious sign of Russia's backwardness was serfdom.
Here we go.
According to the 1857 census, more than a third of Russians were serfs, forced to work their master's land with few rights, restrictions on movement, and their status passed down to their children. They were slaves in all but name.
All right, there we go.
In 1861, Alexander II abolished serfdom in Russia. He was hailed as the liberator. But in reality, most former serfs remained trapped in servitude and poverty. Alexander's reforms would continue with the creation of the Zemstva, provincial assemblies with authority over local affairs, including education and social welfare.
Interesting.
In the Far East, Russia forced territorial concessions from a weakened China, leading to the founding of Vladivostok, Russia's major Pacific port.
Okay.
Another uprising by Poles and Lithuanians against Russian rule was once more crushed by the Russian army. In the Caucasus, Russia's long and brutal war against local tribes came to an end, with their leaders swearing oaths of loyalty to the Tsar.
50 years.
In Central Asia, the Russian Empire was gradually expanding southwards. Russian armies defeated the Emirate of Bukhara and the Khanate of Khiva. And by the 1880s, Russia had conquered most of what was then called Turkestan, today the countries of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan. Imperial rivalry in Central Asia between Russia and Britain led to the Great Game, a 19th century version of the Cold War. Centered on Afghanistan, diplomats and spies on both sides tried to win local support, extend their own influence, and limit the expansion of their rival, while avoiding direct military confrontation. Russia decided to sell Alaska to America for $7.2 million. Many Americans thought it was a waste of money. Gold and oil were only discovered there much later.
4 trillion. I mean, at the time, right, the biggest question was, well, why not sell it to Canada? Why not sell it to, you know, just Britain overall? But as he just described, with the Great Game was going on, and there was battling influence for this region of the world and fears of India perhaps falling to the Russians or something worse, is that they really had no other option except for the United States, which they had pretty decent relations with at the time. And yeah, to say that this is the most lopsided trade deal of all time, probably.
Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace was published, still regarded as one of the world's greatest works of literature.
Yep.
The late 19th century was a cultural golden age for Russia, a period of literary greats and outstanding composers. Russia, in support of nationalist revolts in the Balkans against Ottoman rule, went to war with the Ottoman Empire once more. Russian troops crossed the Danube, then with Bulgarian help, fought to secure the vital Shipka Pass. Then they launched a bloody 5-month siege of Plevna in Bulgaria.
Right, because the Bulgarians rebelled against the Ottomans,
Russia
right?
and her allies finally won victory, with their troops threatening Constantinople itself. But at the Congress of Berlin, Russia bowed to international pressure and accepted limited gains, in a settlement that also led to independence for Romania, Serbia, Montenegro, and later Bulgaria.
Then we start to get towards the more modern borders.
Within Russia, radical political groups were increasingly frustrated by Alexander II's limited reforms. There were several failed attempts to assassinate the emperor, but as he prepared to approve new constitutional reforms, he was killed in St. Petersburg by a bomb thrown by members of the People's Will, one of the world's first modern terrorist groups.
Fascinating.
This act of violence would lead only to a new era of repression.
Of course. Fascinating. As he was doing the reforms too.
In 1881, Russian Emperor Alexander II was assassinated by left-wing terrorists in St. Petersburg. Today, the place where he was fatally wounded is marked by the magnificent Church of the Savior on Spilled Blood.
Fascinating.
Alexander II had been a reformer, hailed as the liberator for freeing Russia's serfs. But his son and successor, Alexander III, believed his father's reforms had unleashed dangerous forces within Russia that ultimately led to his death.
So I'm curious though, so what was the discontent exactly, right? Because yes, okay, you might not like the policy, but then what was the sort of push to assassination, especially if he was going to reform this anyways? Obviously, there's only so much you can say in a history of an entire country, but that's what I'm curious about the reasons for the assassination.
As emperor, he publicly vowed to reassert autocratic rule. declaring that, in the midst of our great grief, the voice of God orders us to undertake courageously the task of ruling, with faith in the strength and rightness of autocratic power.
Well, all right.
The Tsar's secret police, the so-called Okranka, was ordered to infiltrate Russia's many revolutionary groups. Those found guilty of plotting against the government were hanged or sent into internal exile in Siberia. Alexander III was a pious man who supported the Orthodox Church and the assertion of a strong Russian national identity. Russia's Jews became victims of this policy. They'd already been targeted in murderous race riots known as pogroms, after false rumors were spread that they were responsible for the assassination of the emperor. Now, the government expelled 20,000 Jews from Moscow, and many who could began to leave the country. Over the next 40 years, around 2 million Jews would leave Russia, most bound for the USA.
And who benefited from this? The USA.
Concerned.
Right, and so the history of anti-Semitism, especially in Europe, is a very deep, long, and complex one. But in the book I'm reading is that anti-Semitism really was, I mean, obviously Germany being probably the most famous nation for its anti-Semitism, obviously the perpetrator of the Holocaust, but the pogroms which had happened earlier in European history, especially in Eastern Europe, were just as, obviously there's nothing on the scale of something like the Holocaust, but we're brutal, vicious, and violent in their execution, right? Especially in modern Ukraine, as well as in places like Romania, Bulgaria to a degree, even Hungary, right? To a certain extent. Unfortunately, anti-Semitism is as vicious as, as other forms of discrimination based on ethnicity.
By the growing power of Germany, Russia signed an alliance with France, both sides promising military aid if the other was attacked.
This would not affect anything at all.
Sergei Witte was appointed Russia's new Minister of Finance. His reforms helped to modernize the Russian economy and encourage foreign investment, particularly from its new ally, France. French loans helped Russia to develop its industry and infrastructure. Work began on the Trans-Siberian Railway. Completed in 1916, it remains the world's longest railway line, running 5,772 miles, from Moscow to Vladivostok.
I think it takes almost 2 weeks or something. It's ridiculous. Maybe it's 10 days or something.
Alexander III was succeeded by his son, Nicholas II.
Uh-oh.
His coronation was marred by tragedy when 1,400 people were crushed to death at an open-air celebration in Moscow.
1,400? Oh my God.
China granted Russia the right to build a naval base at Port Arthur. When China faced a major revolt known as the Boxer Rebellion, Russia moved troops into Manchuria under the pretext of defending Port Arthur from the rebels. This brought Russia into conflict with Japan, who also had designs over Manchuria and Korea. The Japanese made a surprise attack on Port Arthur, then defeated the Russian army at the giant Battle of Mukden.
Yeah, and this really sort of instilled Japanese confidence as well at this time, where they had just defeated a great European power, as well as their sort of imperialist ambitions would grow larger and larger until the eventual invasion of China in 1937.
Russia's Baltic Fleet, meanwhile, had sailed halfway around the world to reach the Pacific, where it was immediately annihilated at the Battle of Tsushima.
So I did a video on that. Go check it out. It's the dumbest Russian voyage that no one talks about. It's a fantastic little video. Go check it out if you can. I'll leave a title card in the top. hilarious story. This video's already getting long enough, so I won't talk about it. So go check out the
Russia
video.
was left with no option but to sign a humiliating peace, brokered by US President Theodore Roosevelt.
Yep.
Meanwhile, the Tsar faced another crisis much closer to home. In St. Petersburg, a strike by steel workers had escalated, and plans were made for a mass demonstration. Tens of thousands of protesters marched to the Winter Palace to present a petition to the Tsar, asking for better workers' rights and more political freedom. But instead, troops opened fire on the crowds, killing more than 100. Bloody Sunday, as it became known, led to more strikes and unrest across the country. The crew of the battleship Potemkin mutinied, killing their officers and taking control of the ship. To defuse the crisis, Nicholas II reluctantly issued the October Manifesto, drafted under the supervision of Sergei Witte. It promised an elected assembly and new political rights, including freedom of speech, and was welcomed by most moderates. Russia's first constitution was drafted the next year. For the first time, the Tsar would share power with an elected assembly, the State Duma, though the Tsar had the right to veto its legislation and dissolve it at any time.
Exactly. So in turn, the State Duma really had absolutely no power. It was just kind of a prop piece to appease the masses, if you will, through the Tsar. And the Tsar still ruled with absolute authoritarianism, right? There was no sort of democracy, if you will, in any sense.
Sergei Witte finally lost the Tsar's confidence and was dismissed. The Tsar's new Prime Minister, Stolypin, introduced land reforms to help the peasants, while dealing severely with Russia's would-be revolutionaries, so much so that the hangman's noose got a new nickname, Stolypin's necktie. But having survived several attempts on his life, Stolypin was shot and killed by an assassin at the Kiev Opera House.
So bloody. How many assassinations have we had at this point? Wow.
Meanwhile, Grigory Rasputin, a Siberian faith healer, had joined the imperial family's inner circle, thanks to his unique ability to ease the suffering of the Tsar's hemophiliac son, Alexei. Despite sporadic acts of terrorism, Russia now had the fastest growing economy in Europe.
Alter. Alright, time to edit. Whatever. I'm leaving it in.
Unique ability to ease the suffering. Tsar and his family were on the rise. Despite sporadic acts of terrorism,
I'm leaving it in.
Russia now had the fastest growing economy in Europe. Agricultural and industrial output were on the rise. Most ordinary Russians remained loyal to the Tsar and his family. Russia's future seemed bright.
The downfall of Russia.
In 1914, in Sarajevo, a Slav nationalist assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, sparking a European crisis. When Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, Emperor Nicholas ordered the Russian army to mobilize, to show his support for a fellow Slav nation.
Yeah, and so Russia was really seen as the defender of the Slavs at this point. And when Austria-Hungary, when they invaded Serbia, this was after they were presented with a 10-point plan, I believe, maybe it was 12. And the Serbs agreed to all points except for one, right? Which at that point seems incredibly unreasonable that except for 1 point, you would get invaded anyways. And a lot of people think that sort of World War I was inevitable, but it really wasn't. It was a series of decisions that were made by leaders at the time to continually increase tension until eventually the whole war broke out in and of itself. Even the Kaiser on the eve of war, right, the Kaiser of Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm II, tried to sort of double back and prevent this, what everyone knew would be a massive war from happening. No one at the time was thinking, oh, okay, well, this is just Austria and Serbia, and then maybe Russia will do a thing, and then it'll be over in a year. No, they knew that this was going to be a large war. However, they didn't think that it would last as long as it ended up doing, where the final hostilities were done in 1918 for Germany and for 1917 with the revolution in Russia. So, yeah, World War I, arguably, obviously this is an arguable point, could have been prevented in a manner. What would have happened next? That's anyone's guess.
Austria-Hungary's ally, Germany, saw Russian mobilization as a threat and declared war.
Yep.
Europe's network of alliances came into effect, and soon all the major powers were marching to war.
And again, something that just spun completely out of control so quickly too, so quickly, right? When Austria-Hungary, I'll get that right, did invade Serbia, the time that went through before Germany's marching through Belgium, which again, they committed atrocities there, which brought the British in, right? And it just snowballed so quickly into at the time the largest human conflict in human history.
World War I had begun. Russia experienced a wave of patriotic fervor.
Yep, just as Germany did.
St. Petersburg,
France,
was
Britain,
even renamed Petrograd to sound less German.
Yes.
An early Russian advance.
And this was actually a phenomenon that even happened to a country like Canada as well, where just outside of Toronto, there's a town called Kitchener, which was originally called Berlin, Ontario. However, due to sort of anti-German sentiments at the time, it was all renamed into more Anglo-sounding things. So Kitchener being after Lord Kitchener, right?
Into East Prussia ended with heavy defeats at Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes.
And Germany was able to push.
There was greater success against Austria-Hungary, but that too came at a high price.
Many casualties.
Russian losses forced the army to make a general retreat in 1915. In 1916, Russia's Brusilov offensive against Austro-Hungarian forces was one of the most successful Allied attacks of the war.
Yep.
But losses were so heavy that the Russian army was unable to launch any more major operations. In Petrograd, Rasputin, whose alleged influence over the Tsar's family was despised by certain Russian aristocrats, was murdered, possibly with the help of British agents.
Oh, that's demonetized. Exactly, and so eventually the Austro-Hungarian front was much more successful for Russia than the German one, but eventually they were pushed back into revolution, though Russians fought incredibly hard during this war, and this is nothing to say of their troop quality or anything like this.
The war put intolerable strains on Russia. At the front, losses were enormous, while in the cities, economic mismanagement led to rising prices and food shortages. In Petrograd, the workers' frustration led to strikes and demonstrations. Troops ordered to disperse the crowds refused and joined the protesters instead. The government had lost control of the capital. On board the Imperial train at Puskov.
Yep. And one another thing that Tsar Nicholas did too is that he eventually, I don't remember when, maybe it was 16, maybe 1917, I don't remember. He personally took charge of the army and started interfering with the generals, right? Sometimes history repeats itself. Allegedly, that is what is happening right now with the conflict in Ukraine. I don't know if that's true, but that's just what I've been reading. And so the double-edged sword of that one is, if you win, you get all the credit. If you lose, well, look at all to who all the backlash is going towards. It ain't going towards your generals, it's going to the head of the country, right? So this, although there was already a lot of discontent, this little switch really was one of the factors that really did drive it into overdrive.
Senior politicians and generals told the emperor he must abdicate, or Russia would descend into anarchy and lose the war. Nicholas accepted their advice and renounced the throne in favour of his brother, Grand Duke Michael, who effectively declined the offer.
I don't blame him.
400 years of Romanov rule were at an end. Russia was now a republic.
Very briefly.
A provisional government took power, but could not halt Russia's slide into economic and military chaos.
Yes.
Workers, soldiers and peasants elected their own councils, known as Soviets. The Petrograd Soviet was so powerful it was effectively a rival government, especially as discontent with the provisional government continued to grow.
Exactly, and so this is where the Menshevik-Bolshevik conflict comes in. The Bolsheviks obviously being led by Vladimir Lenin, and the Mensheviks. There is some interesting sort of alt history, is that if the Mensheviks had have ended the war, which they were against actually, they wanted to stay into the war, would the Bolsheviks have actually been able to seize power in the same way that they eventually did? Who knows? That's a whole what if altist video in and of itself. But the Mensheviks were sort of made of liberals, social democrats, and also not really hardline communists, but definitely to the left of the spectrum, whereas the Bolsheviks were by far the more extreme party in every single way in compared to the Mensheviks overall. Mensheviks, by the way, just means majority, I think.
The Bolsheviks under Vladimir Lenin attracted growing support with their radical proposals for an immediate end to the war,
incredibly
the
radical
redistribution of land, and transfer of power to the Soviets. In October, they launched a coup, masterminded by Leon Trotsky. Bolshevik Red Guards stormed the Winter Palace, where the provisional government met, and arrested its members. Lenin and the Bolsheviks were now in charge. Russia had been thrown upon a bold and dangerous course. Under a Marxist-inspired revolutionary party, it would now seek to create the world's first communist state. But first, it would have to survive the chaos and slaughter of one of history's bloodiest civil wars.
Yes, absolutely. Fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. Thank you all very much for joining me on this one. Let me know which country you guys want me to focus on next. Maybe Poland, Austria, Germany. I don't know. Let me know. Maybe even Canada if you want. But that was really, really great. There were so many things that I didn't learn, that I didn't know, and I'd learned about, and just the history of Russia, man. Oh, just brutal, complex, bloody, brutal, but absolutely fascinating, and another brilliant video done by Epic History TV. I had a few questions in there. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, and if you want me to continue. I saw that there was a video that they had recommended on the 1917 revolution. Maybe you want me to check out Oversimplified. Do we want to keep going from 1917 onwards? Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Thank you all very, very, very much for joining me on this one, and I will see you guys in the next video. Take care.